Okay, we are good.
Wait, I'm gonna pause it.
Exactly. Okay.
Alrighty, welcome to round 5. Follow on the Prime Minister. Here, here. Yeah.
Okay, everyone good?
Yes.
Our first argument is that you view wars of territorial aggression as principally unjust. Because you experienced the Japanese war, you saw how barbaric these wars are, and you don't want to subject other people to the same thing. You fought against Japanese rule for the Korean people, and as a communist and Korean nationalist, you believe that all Korean working class are worthy of respect, and therefore it's wrong to kill them to advance your own ends, especially because there are other ways of encouraging Korean reunification, such as the UN or grassroots revolt in the South. In particular, communist thought advocates global governments. You should try out the new global government instead of resorting to war. Our second argument is that you will lose the war. First, wars of aggression are hard. Your troops will be less familiar with the territory than the South Korean military. South Korean troops will fight harder because they're fighting to protect their homes and families. This difference is particularly acute because your troops are very war-weary after fighting World War II and the Chinese Civil War. 2, the international community will intervene. 2 key actors. 1, the US will intervene. 5 reasons why. The reason is domino theory. The first reason is domino theory. The Cold War is in full swing, and the US is worried that if one nation falls to communism, then revolutions and invasions might be inspired all across the world. By intervening in Korea, the US establishes a clear deterrent against other military invasions, such as in West Germany, Vietnam, or Yugoslavia. Second reason is to establish credibility with its allies. The US is trying to build alliances around the globe to counter Soviet influence. Defending South Korea makes the US look like a reliable ally. The third reason is that the US has trade relationships with the South through companies like Samsung, so the business lobby will encourage American intervention. The fourth reason is to appease the Japanese. In the aftermath of World War II, the US was very worried about remilitarization in Germany and Japan because these countries have strong industrial bases and a network of battle-trained and battle-ready military generals. This is why they explicitly wrote pacifist language into the Japanese constitution during the American occupation of Japan. Given that Kim Il-sung was one of the foremost enemies of the Japanese during its occupation of Korea and war in Japan and China, Japan is likely to remilitarize to protect itself against North Korean aggression if it believes North Korea poses a threat, which is more likely if North Korea ramps up military production. Moreover, South Korea is strategically important geographically for any war against Japan, so Japan will likely intervene in South Korea in the event of a North Korean invasion. This is independently sufficient for you to lose the war because Japan is a much larger nation with a strong industrial base and lots of well-trained soldiers. The fifth reason is the military-industrial complex. Military contractors like Lockheed built a tremendous capacity during the Second World War that is responsible for millions of jobs across the US. These contracts directly lobby the government to build up more military strength, which means that the US military has a lot of supplies to fight wars and encourage a more belligerent US foreign policy in order to boost demand for their products. 2, the UN will intervene. Because the Chinese Sea is held by the nationalists and the USSR is boycotting the Security Council, they will pass a resolution to defend South Korea. Their incentive to do this follow many of the US's, but this is also the explicit mandate of the UN to prevent wars of aggression and territorial conquest. This also provides more cover for US intervention because with global backing, it's easier to justify the war to the general public. If the US intervenes, you certainly lose. The US is the world's largest industrial base and most advanced military, and it's one of the most populated countries. Their military is hyper-efficient and professional because they've just come out of World War II, and the risk of the Cold War turning hot has buoyed high levels of military spending. The US also has nukes. If you get nuked, there's no way for you not to die. These bombs are more deadly than the kind used in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and they're likely to be used on important targets where you also are. The US is very likely to strategically use nukes to cripple North Korean morale and manufacturing. The US just used nukes literally 5 years ago in Japan, so there's no reason to expect them not to do so again. In fact, the US has an active incentive to do this because it's very cheap compared to waging a war with boots on the ground, so this is an easy way for them to establish that invading an ally is a red line one shouldn't cross. Op may say mutually assured destruction, but the USSR only had 5 years to work on building up a nuclear stockpile by this time, whereas the US has been working on building nuclear weapons since the early 1940s. The US also has a technological advantage in terms of anti-aircraft missiles and nuclear submarines. That means it's not as worried about retaliatory strikes as it is when the USSR catches up later on with very fast missiles and high-tech submarines. The impact of losing the war is bad. 1, you might die. A, it's very likely that you'll actively participate in fighting because you're a trained general and it's a big morale boost given the cult of personality around you. B, others will try to assassinate you because you're a high-profile target, a talented general, and will cause a chaotic power vacuum if you die. Or C, you just get nuked. 2, you might lose territory. Syngman Rhee, the South Korean president, will use this as an excuse to invade the North since he can't credibly say that your regime poses a threat to the South's security. He's likely to succeed because A, you'll lose a lot of troops and equipment in your attempted invasion because offensive wars are hard, and B, the US and other Western allies also want to use this as an excuse to get an ally directly on China and Russia's border. With their backing, a counter-invasion is super easy. 3, this is bad for your domestic credibility. Losing the war risks a coup or revolt against you. People will think that you wasted lives and money. People also think less of your military prowess, hurting your cult of personality. People think you're a strategic genius because of your efficiency against the Japanese, and losing a war against the South Koreans squanders that. Our third argument is that even if you win the war, that's bad for you. One, South Korea will backlash. Even if you annex South Korea, people will resist you because you killed their friends and family. Also, they've been the recipient of substantial anti-North and pro-capitalist propaganda over the past 5 years. This means that they're likely to constantly launch guerrilla attacks that will be a significant drain on your resources and make your government look weak. These resistance movements are likely to be given aid by the CIA or Japan, making them extremely efficient. Two, North Korean backlash. North Koreans are sick of war after fighting for decades. They'd much rather have food on the table and economic security than more land and hundreds of miles away. Both of these things are undermined by a war effort, so you become a lot less popular. Other leaders may try to backstab you, or your citizens might defect to other countries, probably your enemy, the South, both of which are a risk to your regime. Coups are particularly likely to assassinate you or lock you up in prison for life. Three, this is a waste of money. Both Koreans are very poor right now because colonialism extracted resources from states, and there was just a protracted war. You want to kickstart development by directing resources into productive industries like manufacturing. Other communist powerhouses like China and the USSR will be more likely to give you money and resources if they don't think you'll use it productively. You're economically and militarily ahead of the South right now. You shouldn't give up this lead by wasting all of your resources on a war right now. Development is very important because it builds goodwill among Koreans. If South Koreans see the North is prospering more than the South, they'll organically revolt to join the North's prosperity. Our fourth argument is about foreign relations. Your allies will backlash. The USSR and China are campaigning to get China on the Security Council, which would be harder if they look like they're supporting a state that flaunts international law. Gaining another and cementing the power of communism in China is way more important to them than spreading communism to South Korea. Two, the USSR also wants to avoid setting a precedent that it will allow West Germany to invade East Germany, endangering their European interests, which are closer to their population centers than Korea. This also detracts from resources that they might invest in European conflicts, and they care about Europe way more than you. Three, China might bargain you away, offering to turn on you if the West starts recognizing them over Taiwan. Supremacy is more legitimate to China, is more important to them than you are. Four, most people are anti-war after the horrors of World War II, so belligerents will make the rest of the world turn against you. The second thing is that the West will backlash. Even if they don't go to war, they can embargo and sanction you. And thirdly, you'll lose the threat of invasion as a negotiating chip. You currently have a better military and economy than the South, which gives you the power to extract demand with them. Moreover, your ally is right on your doorstep, whereas the US is far away. You can use your position to force South Korea to submit to you, possibly creating trade relations between your two nations and getting limited territorial concessions. You can also devote money toward nuclear weapons instead of a war right now, which would be a much better tool for diplomatic power. The US is going to make it harder and harder to build nukes because they want to maintain their advantage, so it's really now or never. They can do this by restricting trade of important elements or surveilling scientists with know-how. This is the only way for you to be truly independent from the USSR and China, since you don't have the population to compete with other big countries economically or militarily. This will also enable you to extract more from South Korea or really anybody far into the long run. For these reasons, proud to propose.
Here, thank you. Hello.
It'll be framing off case, on case. Everyone good?
First graph, what we're doing.
The top of the off case.
Wait, sorry, is framing on case or off case?
Off case.
Oh, sorry.
What do you care about as Kim Il-sung? You care about getting your land back and nationalism. Why? Is that even if you individually don't, every citizen does, and you have a greater constitutive obligation to them. Two is that you've been raised in the anti-imperialist rhetoric. Are you failing to reunify? Signals that you believe that this war is the best way to reunify because you see South Korea as a defector and you yourself as a good guy, which means that you see them as really important to you. Your legitimacy also then comes from the claim that you're the rightful leader of all of Korea. Before, both you and the RE claim to be the only legitimate government, and you're terrified it's happening the other way, and the RE becoming the actual legitimate government. Also, nationalism is just stronger now than ever because division right now is seen as a colonial humiliation. So isn't just like Korea should be unified, is that you actively need to kick out foreign actors. The first argument is just you are cooked if you do nothing. North Korea is likely to be erased off the map if they don't invade because the US and South Korea will invade, like 7 reasons. One is that Truman literally explicitly argues that the US needs to confront communism wherever it appears, and this means that North Korea is the place they'll do this the most, more than anything, because of how close it is to the Soviets. Two is that it threatens the US Pacific strategy with Japan. If the Soviets have South Korea, they can create more naval bases and have long-range artillery sent towards Japan and threaten signaling, like shipping lanes. Three is that the president of South Korea vocally wanted to invade. He's been asking for offensive weapons, and the U.S. is under the impression that if South Korea will do it anyways, then they might need to help. 4 is that even if North Korea doesn't do it, the U.S. is terrified of losing on the Asian front due to how geographically far they are, and the fear that every communist state is Soviet puppet and proxy. This is magnified by the fact that they also just lost China. If South Korea invades you, you're going to be really bad on the defensive. 1 is you're just not prepared for it because you don't know when they're going to invade and when they're building up the missiles to do it. 2 is that the Soviets can't help you fast enough because they literally are blockading. They're protesting against the Security Council, and per all of their arguments, they're militarily far behind. 3 is that China and the USSR don't think you're as strategic as the US thinks South Korea is strategic, and the US thinks South Korea is strategic, which means even if they help quickly, they won't be able to win. 4 is that defensive wars are far harder than offensive wars because to gain territory, you just need a couple like erratic guerrilla wins, which is what your army is good at. Comparatively, you're garbage at defense because those wars are wars of attrition. You just have to keep fighting and can never take a break. Despite the war, your country is still falling apart internally for 5 reasons. 1 is that one is food shortage. North Korea is facing like huge famines at this time, and it's really, really bad when people just like hate this. This is also much more proximate to them because they're literally like their families are dying and things like that. 2 is that internal revolt because there's like 4 competing factions in North Korea at the time, which also means all of these are like vying for control, and this is the only way that you can unify them. 3 is that you need to at least show that they're trying to gain land to appease, and also there's like no warm water ports and things like that, which is really bad for trade. It also means that even if all of their economic arguments are true, it doesn't matter because you're already cooked economically when you don't have ports to be able to trade with other countries. 5 is that you're economically cooked in relative to South Korea and Japan because they're already developing more than you. The second argument then is just you win the war. The corruption in South Korea, and there's a few reasons for this. First is that there's corruption in South Korea and a lack of resources. Militarily, North Korea is overwhelmingly stronger than South Korea because it only has U.S. advisories. The U.S. literally pulled out the year before, which means that there's literally no active U.S. troops in the area, so there's no combat forces. But also soldiers will defect in South Korea because South Korea is on the verge of internal collapse because of these corruption arguments, and they're comparatively worse than North Korea at the moment because of the fact that the U.S. just left and they were dependent on the U.S. for all this time, which means now that they've left, they have to rebuild this infrastructure. But also 3 is that South Korea just can't get help fast enough, so even if they were perfect and they had all of this military capability, the U.S. won't intervene and they won't be able to get help. But there are a few reasons as to why the U.S. won't intervene first, and the Security Council won't either. First is that the Security Council literally cannot pass anything because the Soviet Union is going to just veto everything, which is what the boycott means, which means you can't get the Security Council mobilized enough, which also means that there's no threat of backlash. The second is that the U.S. won't intervene because of things like war fatigue. After World War II, they just don't have any domestic political sentiment to go to war. I'll answer their lobbying arguments on the on case too, is that there's just no way to spin it because China just fell to communism, which means U.S. credibility in Asia already is collapsing, and the U.S. was unwilling to defend a huge global ally. Then it's not really, there's no point in fighting for South Korea, so there's no political sentiment. And 3 is that even if you don't buy this, there's at least a link as to why they will take longer to intervene, or if they intervene quickly, they're super bad at it. This means that this is just a time frame argument because the U.S. pulled out all of their troops and there's only like a few hundred advisors left. You don't think that they're a threat, and it's a perception of it's not a factor in your decision calculus. And even if they were a threat, the time it would take for them to invade you would be so long that you probably just know that you can tip the tides before they launch a full-scale attack because they have to mobilize all of their troops and send them back. Which means that you're probably going to not think this is a part of your decision calculus. The third argument then is even if you lose the war, the fallout just isn't bad. First is that North Korea was already economically backwards, and losing them won't meaningfully worsen living standards. 2 is that Stalin and Mao will try not to allow them to fall because they'll protect him no matter what, even if because Kim knows that the USSR wants Korea as the Korean buffer to protect from China, which just had a revolution and also needs a safe border. But note that this only happens after the war because right now Soviets are protesting the Security Council and aren't that strong, which means that Soviets also need time in order to build up their troops. But sees that the war just increases domestic power. Even in defeat, he gets emergency powers and justification to purge rival factions, increase militarization because of more social control, which solves all of the arguments above as to why North Korea is existentially doomed right now because of wartime emergency powers override all internal constraints, i.e. he can just legally justify suspension of civil liberties, mass arrests, and things like that, and he can purge rival factions during the war, i.e. he can just call them cowards, which also gives him the political capital to be able to do so. War also allows Kim to transform it into a hyper-militarized state, which gives him the infrastructure to check back against future boycotts and things like that, which means in the long term you are able to get much more state surveillance, which is really good for him. But D is that after the war the repercussions are not that bad because Kim becomes more entrenched even if there's defeat because there's ideological and political messaging that they survived the imperialists and stood up to capital war, and this becomes a basis for long-term militarization and politics of fear, which are way more internal party loyalty because the only people that are left are the ones that have fought a war with him, and the sunk cost fallacy means that the soldiers and everyone else will just stay loyal to him, which means that even if you do die, which means that you're not going to die, but even if you do die, you're creating a long legacy that is something that you are willing to do because you die in power, your son inherits it, his son inherits it, which means you have generationally created a legacy for yourself. And as wartime politicians, you know that the risk of death is high, and you care way caring more about the legacy of your country, and you also are probably just like not as averse to this because you've probably seen conflict before the on case. They say it's unjust. You think it's principally unjust. First, that Kim is not a liberal moral actor. I.e., he's a revolutionary Marxist Leninist. He does not care about he thinks anti-colonial violence is like for a form of liberation, and South Koreans are just opposed to victims of U.S. imperialism, and they view the regime as a fascist puppet state, which means that they think that it's going to be bad. But they say that the domino theory and things like that. But the domino theory literally does not exist at this time yet. This is a ridiculous argument. Eisenhower coins this later. They say that there's going to be lobbying interest for the military-industrial complex, but first is that's just a reason as to why they want to intervene in a war, not this war. And there's also tons of other conflicts going on. This just doesn't seem profitable because it seems like a civil war, and it's super unpredictable because you don't know which country will just back out. But also in 1950, the U.S. does not have any emerged commercial states in Korea, and South Korea is an economic wasteland compared to other things, and they care way more about the Marshall Plan than Germany and stuff like that, which means all of the lobbying interests are focused there. They also nukes won't happen because of things like mutually assured destruction. This also answers their USSR argument because it doesn't matter. It's not a question of comparative harm. It's just an absolute harm. I.e., it doesn't matter if the U.S. is stronger. They still don't want to be bombed. They say that you're going to losing the war is bad. This is largely non-unique. It doesn't matter. They say you're going to die and things like that, but you already undertook this risk. Clearly, your real preference means that you care more about ideology. They say you get invaded because the regime poses threat to South security, but you get invaded on either side, and they need to prove that they didn't want to do this before, and that Western allies are going to see this as an excuse. But war fatigue is a higher order issue for them, which means even if they do, they wouldn't do it right now. Meaning right now is your strategic window. They say it's bad for domestic credibility, but the population won't blame it on you because they're nationalists, and they will blame it on the West and other imperialist nations. If anything, you're trying to fight them, which means you're fighting the odds. They say you're less likely to get resources from China, but North Korea is valuable because of its resistance to South Korea, which means this is the only instance in which you'd actually get aid during the conflict. China also hates South Korea because of the old tributary system, and they think that Korea is against them, and they are seen as helping North Korea retaliate. They also can't do anything because they don't have trade, economic prowess, and things like that. They say China will bargain you away, but ideological dominance is more powerful than ever before in history, which is why countries during this time are so afraid of losing ideological allies, which is true for ideological supremacy. They say the West will embargo you, but you don't have much support from the West anyway, which makes this not unique. They wouldn't ally with you in the first place, so their embargo isn't effective. Second, the port's argument answers this, and third is that this is just a reason for why you would win the war because they say you have better militaries in the South, so you can extract and demand with them. No, it's a reason why you would win, and you would get the full advantage of having the war. But also, unlike you, South Korea has Western aid, so they'll be more resistant to financial and economic leverage, which means that you which answers their argument about limited territorial concessions, because if insofar as they're more resilient and things like that, they're not going to be able to concede to you. But also, even if they do, the domestic uprising means that you won't get access to these arguments. Back to oppose.
Here, thank you, follow MG.
Okay. We'll probably follow the LOC. Oh wait, actually, let me pull one thing up. I will try to be not as fast. Time will begin on my first word.
Wait, sorry, what did you say?
Follow the LOC.
On framing, we agree that you're a Korean nationalist, but you probably care more about the Korean people first, right? This is the framing that comes at the top of the PMC that I don't think is clearly dealt with. Their only argument is oh, you care about land and that's all you really give a shit about. But we think that the idea of Korean nationalism means that you value Korean lives over the idea of Korean land, right? Especially in the short term. You've just gotten out of a war. You think these things are super barbaric and you don't want to kill fellow Koreans. Here's the unique delta, right? There are claims on land, reclaiming or whatever, or you apply in cases when it's Japanese imperialism because you don't care about killing the Japanese, but these are your friends and brothers and you don't want to kill them just for the purpose of getting some land. Instead, you would prefer all the mechanizations that are conceded from the PMC as to why there will be internal revolts in South Korea later, or things like that will just lead to organic reunification that are never really answered. I think these are much better ways that Kim recognizes to get back South Korea and get the land reclamation that don't necessarily entail we're killing all of your brothers. You're also not an idiot, right? You're a tactical war strategist. That means that you're not going to send your people on a suicide mission, which means that at their best case, even if everything that they say is true, we win any reasons as to why you think the war probably isn't going to be favorable for you, or at least it's going to be really fucking hard, your military strategy is going to be like, shit, let's not do it right now. Instead, let's, I don't know, invest in manufacturing or food or something like that, or all of the problems that they outlined themselves in the LOC, and then you can just invade like 10 years down the line or something like that. On case. Top level on this idea that South Korea invades first. Number one, all the reasons about why wars of aggression are hard in the PMC mean that South Korea is unlikely to do this. Even if they do, they're unlikely to succeed. This is also because your military is currently much stronger than the South's because you have access to Soviet weapons, etc. Number two, the US and Korean business office will pressure the government not to invade because war is bad for business. Number three, the US won't flout the proposed UN reunification plan when they and all of their allies control the UN. Number four, even if they're not going to invade you, the comparative is that they do this after you invade and then you lose, which means your troops are decimated and they now have American backing. But let's say that the South Korean invasion does happen. 4 reasons as to why South Korea invading first is better for you. Number one, an invasion by the South is good for your popularity. Rally around the flag because it boosts your credibility. This kicks in way more when you're invaded because you're waging unnecessary war. Moreover, you're better at repelling invasions than fighting offensive wars because that's your prior experience. Guerrilla tactic fighting is a defensive strategy. Number two, an invasion by the South also makes the government look very bad. South Korea is a poor country, and if their leaders start wasteful wars, socialist movements in the South gain a lot more traction. Number three, you're likely to win this war if they invade first. Remember, in background, we said it came as a guerrilla and a super successful one. It's an inherently defensive strategy because it relies on getting invaded to work. Moreover, the key delta is they don't actually tell you what the land looks like on South Korea versus North Korea. South Korea is flat. North Korea has mountains. Guerrilla only works if you're fighting in the mountains and the trees and shit like that. It doesn't work if it's fucking flat. So you can't use any of your military tactics if you are invading South Korea, but you can use all of your military tactics if they invade you. So you have the territorial advantage, which supersedes all of Shruti's analysis that comes out of the LOC about South Koreans will fight hard or whatever, because the inherent military strategy advantage that comes from the fact that the type of war that you're really good at can only happen on your home turf outweighs. Some line-by-line stuff. They say that Truman is needs the U.S. to get rid of communism and a bunch of U.S. incentives. I think the U.S. is pretty tired of war, right? Post World War II and things like that. They probably don't want to deal with war and things like that. Now they're knocking, but here's the unique delta, right? We think that the U.S. is not going to deal with this idea of if there's a passive threat, i.e. North Korea is sitting there and they're communists and they're like, all right, let the Soviets have them. We're tired of war. The same way we Hitler do his pacifist shit in Czechoslovakia or before Czechoslovakia invasion and all of that. But at the point that it becomes an active threat, and we are now losing a new ally in South Korea that has, this strategic backing, etc., that's when the U.S. is forced to invade. So, I think the net loss of an ally is what then forces the U.S. to be like, shit, I'm anti-war, but fuck, I guess I have to because I don't want to lose South Korea. But if North Korea is just chilling there, this is not that big of a problem. The delta is not explained when Shruti blips through a bunch of things with no warranting. On the idea of the defensive wars are harder, I don't think that you necessarily need to know when, because you can A, mobilize pretty quickly, and B, your troops are probably ready. You're primed for an invasion. I mean, look how militarized the 37th parallel is. This makes no sense. They say that you need the Soviets. I don't think you necessarily need the Soviets because you have the territorial advantage. It's a defensive tactic. I already explained this. They then give you a bunch of reasons like food. North Korea has famines and you need manufacturing and you're cooked economically because you don't have ports. Great. Don't spend money on war and build a port. Get food and solve all the problems that they are then outlining in the LOC. I think this is pretty clear out of the PMC. They say that there are competing factions in North Korea that you need to revolt them and things like that. I think the internal factions that do exist at this time, they give you no characterization as to who they are. These factions are people that are war plus war and anti-war, and some people are warmongers, and some people are more on Kim's side, and they're anti-warmongers, and so these factions are then more pacified, if anything, on our side of the house when you choose not to invade, and so there's not this split that exists. That probably answers the argument 1. Second argument, you'll win the war. First, I think it's probably the first warrant that the U.S. has no troops in the area probably knifes the first argument about the U.S. invading North Korea with the South, which means that if the South invades, they'll just do it without the U.S. But I think that the U.S. will probably just support because they don't want communists to spread. They'll come back and North Korea knows this. So here's what they're the burden of proof on them is now to prove that North Korea achieves a super decisive victory over South Korea before the U.S. troops go back. I think the time frame is super murky here, and I think North Korea is not stupid, right? They're probably going to sit there and be like, all right, even if I take over half of South Korea in the time that it takes the U.S. to mobilize, then the U.S. will get there, and then they're going to get butt fucked. It's super clean as to why North Korea doesn't want to lose all of their troops when the U.S. does inevitably get involved, which means that they have to win, that before the U.S. gets involved, that North Korea fully takes over South Korea and makes it super unstrategic for the U.S. to do so. It makes absolutely no sense. They say that the USSR, the Security Council isn't going to intervene because the USSR will just veto it. Drop from PMC, the USSR is dealing with protests. They're not attending Security Council meetings. They say that there's no domestic or political incentive to intervene. I agree, but I think the domino theory stuff outweighs because it's an active threat. This is the active versus passive analysis that I gave earlier, the delta on losing an ally. They say that like there's some time frame stuff, you can tip the ties before the US steps in. I think that like this just means that North Korea would win the battle but then lose the war. They'll tip the tides a little bit, and then the US will get there, and then they'll just fuck them, and then it's over. Obviously the US would beat North Korea in a war. They say Stalin and Mao will protect you. Fewer responses. Number one, the USSR and China probably don't have incentives. Number two, the Soviets will avoid direct confrontation with the West at all costs because they're equipped in an arms race and they're the only nuclear powers, but the US's weapons are way more power. The reason why is because direct confrontation runs the risk of a nuclear conflict, which is mad, and they probably don't want to do that. China also doesn't have nukes, so they're not going to risk intervening and get nuked by America because they don't want to deal with all of this nonsense. They say that the Soviets are protesting the Security Council and they aren't that strong, so they need time. Great, that means that they probably can't help you. They say wartime emergency power and things like that. I think this is not unique. Kim's already a dictator, so what if he makes himself more of a dictator? They say that there's like long-term militarization. I think this is downstream of them winning the war. They say that soldiers are going to stay loyal to him and things like that. I think that soldiers won't be loyal if one, you seem like a warmonger, and two, if you just lose the war, people think you're a shitty leader. You're a new leader especially, and so if you lose the first war that you just get involved in, people are going to be like, what the fuck? A gov case. First thing they say is that you're Marxist-Leninist, so you don't care about like the unjust principle and things like that. I think this doesn't matter. You're a Korean nationalist first. I dealt with this at the framing at the top, right? You care about your brothers. This is a much more proximal threat to you in terms of like this is what you think is your family. I'm gonna pause for a second. My thing just said that I'm signed out. I don't know why it did that, so I'm gonna sign back in. Sorry, guys. I'm gonna show you. Make sure I'm not doing any sus shit. Okay. I'm at 7:12 on time, and I will be on the first argument at the top of the gov case on the LSE responses. Cool. They say the word domino theory doesn't exist, the concept exists, they want to stop the spread of communism. They say the MIC doesn't necessarily want to intervene in this war as opposed to others. Number one, they always want to make a buck, they have infinite resources. Number two, the Cold War is tense right now, and there aren't that many military struggles that are happening in 1950 or whatever, so there's a huge incentive to get involved here. They say the US has no commercial stakes in South Korea. We tell you that there is Samsung there, and the US is setting up economic alliances and things like that. They say they care more about the Marshall Plan. There's no reason why they can't do the Marshall Plan and this at the same time since private companies going into South Korea, whereas the US government is carrying out the Marshall Plan. They say that there's no nukes because of MAD. We think that MAD doesn't apply because they concede that MAD doesn't exist at this point because the US has had more time to build up their stockpiles, and the USSR hasn't had as much time to build up their stockpiles. They say that the real preference is you care more about ideology. I think that's our point. You care more about the ideology of Korean nationalism, etc., and don't want to kill your brothers. That's our framing. They say that there's war fatigue, and they're not going to blame it on you. They're going to blame it on imperialists. I think that this doesn't make a lot of sense to you. Again, you care about the life of your Korean brothers. That's all the framing at the top of the PMC. I also think that there's no warrant as to why war fatigue is a quote-unquote higher order issue. There's no reason. They say that this is the only instance that you get aid from China. I already answered the incentives on China not wanting to give aid. They gave a bunch of analysis as to why China hates South Korea. Ideological dominance is more powerful, and a bunch of things like that. I think that none of this really matters, and so this is all downstream of the whole China has to support Russia, and China and Russia have to support North Korea. I think that's not going to happen per all the incentives that I gave earlier. They say that South Korea has Western aid, so it's more resistant to economic leverage. I think that resilience just means that there is limited leverage that happens, which is why the limited territorial concessions happen. The fact that they are resilient is why the territorial concessions are limited. That's our point.
You're here. I think I'm hold up, Emma.
Give me offload. I'm going to start on what happens if you don't go to war. Everyone ready? Starting time in 3, 2, 1. Now, what happens if you don't go to war? I want to be really clear. There's a drop argument and the LSE, which right now domestically, politics are very unstable. There are tons of warring factions in the country, which makes it that you are at threat a lot right now, which is why we need to unify them by going to war. They say that nationalist unification is not one in which you are going to war with against other people, but this just doesn't make sense. Obviously, nationalism still applies in cases of civil war. You think that the types of South Koreans that have joined the US are actively people that are not like real Koreans anymore. So any of their arguments are true that you want to help your Korean brethren. The ones that sold out to the West are the ones that you think are actively bad, and the ones that sold out just because of Samsung question are ones that you actually think are valid, which is why you actually don't care about these individual people. And the types of Koreans that you think exist are the ones in South Korea that maybe still believe in communism, or the ones in South Korea that are not super capitalists, or the North Koreans that you believe that North Koreans should have right over everything else. Like, if any of the Sal's arguments are true, there should be a reason why civil war never happens in the first place. They say you don't want to kill other Koreans. I beat that. Also, I just want to deal with what your what your internal things like what your country internally looks like right now. The push we get out of the MG is like, just fix everything internally, and that's what the better thing is. First, they don't deal with analysis that every single person within North Korea that you constitutive obligation to are the ones that hate you. All of Sahil's arguments are like, but you individually don't think about your Korean brethren. But if we're running any of the links on the people, the fact that the people are the people want to go to war, just because a lot of them are just conceded out of the LOC. The people in and of itself are a reason as to why you would go to war. But also, these same people are a reason as to why there is not that much political support to do any of the alternative things that Sahil talks about. So you can't just create a warm water port because one, you don't have the money, two, they concede you don't have Western support, and three, if they are correct, the USSR and China don't have incentives to help you right this moment, then any of those arguments also bite into this because they can't help you create a warm water port either, and there's no domestic political support for you to create a warm water port. So I have no idea how you improve the situation locally. This thing is literally try or die because right now your country is so unbelievably dog shit. You're on the threat of being thrown out by all other four warring countries, and even if you aren't, what the fuck do you have to gain? You have literally no legacy benefits. Even in their absolute best case where you do go to war and lose, all the responses are like going to war and losing is bad, but don't engage in the actual LC warranting as to how you create a legacy and the fact that you took the initiative to stand up for what you believe is correct and what everyone else in your country believes is correct matters more because you can never do anything about the domestic situation. So it's the fact that you're trying to do something about the international one is what's going to make your legacy last without a line. And there's weighing out of the LC that is just conceded as to why your legacy matters more than the chance of death, and they just don't respond to it in the MG. The first thing I want to talk, then they make like organic reunification arguments, but they say that there's a lot of organic reunification arguments we don't respond to. I have no idea where these are on the floor, except for the one at the bottom of the PMC, which is like, but you can do like little trade stuff, and you can like leverage getting back certain territories. They're just conceded defense from the LOC on this, which is that I have no idea why the fuck they would ever trade with you, or why they would ever care about these financial deals, because the resilience argument, Sahil misunderstands this to be an argument about war. It's not an argument about war. The argument is that if South Korea is literally is buddy-buddy with the United States because Samsung exists, then what the fuck do you have to offer them? Maybe you yourself have better trade relations with South Korea, which is obviously not true for all the conceded LOC defense, but even if you did, you have nothing to offer them that the US can't. They never want to give up land because for all the reasons why you believe you are the rightful Koreans, they believe the same thing too, and you can't offer them any amount of money the US can't to make them stop believing that. The next thing I'm going to talk about is what does the war actually look like. The most relevant question above all the guerrilla warfare arguments are actually just the resource question, because one, the guerrilla warfare arguments are path dependent on the offense-defense divide, but we give you arguments as to why guerrilla warfare is good in offense. They give you arguments as to why guerrilla warfare is in defense. This means the deadlock breaker is about the resource question, because the capacity question is what controls how you use this guerrilla warfare, whether you can do other things that are not guerrilla warfare. But second, the only other way guerrilla warfare could come upstream to the resource question is if you buy Sahil's analysis, the geography is very different. This is just an assertion that is not true, guys. Like mountains in some place and land in some place else. No, there's mountainous and flat regions in both places. The geography of both places is quite similar. The fact that they are both part of the same peninsula likely means that you have some type of geography, and or absolute worst case, the people in North Korea who were once unified with South Korea are probably quite familiar with that territory because the unified Korea used to fight lots of wars together. It means at worst you already know what the territory looks like. You're not that out of your element anyway. The resource question and about allies is the only relevant question that is determining on this clash. Why are we winning the US or the China? Okay, so I'm first going to say that the US is not going to help you right now. They say the time frame question is murky and that like you don't know whether the US is going to want to help or the US doesn't want to go to war at all. That want to be very clear. Our argument is not that the US never wants to go to war, the US will always want to go to war. It's that the US is taking a 20-year break from war, which is why the Korean War is the only war they even got remotely engaged in after World War II and before every single proxy conflict they fought in the 70s for all the conceded defense from the LOC. They say you can do the Marshall Plan and this as well, but the argument is not about the Marshall Plan. The more important one is they are recovering from World War II because of how dangerous and how detrimental it was. And even if they could theoretically win the war, the domestic support for it is quite low. Even if they could theoretically win the war, even if they theoretically did have the advantage, the fact that the arms race is so threatening to them is a reason why they are terrified. Because Russia, who was just their ally, who they were just like somewhat happy with before, now defected is the reason why every single person in the US is terrified. And they know this is literally happening on the other side of the Pacific. I mean, they have to be ultra sure before they ever go to war in the first place. And this is a real preference argument, which is how we know that America goes to war in the first place. Because this is the only way they decided to go to war in World War II. They didn't get invaded
involved until it was very late, until they were absolutely sure. And the burden for their arguments about the US getting involved is that they know for a fact they're going to cook you, but obviously they aren't meeting that burden, and they can't meet that burden until they are fully recovered from World War II or any of the other litany of things that Shruti talks about. They're not going to get involved for the next 20-some years. And Sahil says the time frame is murky. It just isn't. Like, look at history. There were 4 proxy conflicts in the 70s, and then nothing. The only one in between this was the Korean War. And obviously the US didn't have that much help, or at least you believe they aren't going to help that much for all these reasons, because every single reason as to why there were no proxy conflicts in the 70s are the ones that are conceded out of the LOC. This means if the US gets involved, it is only in 1970 when they are having South Korea invade you if you don't do anything, which is a clash I'll get to later. But the first question I'm going to answer is why China and the USSR are going to help you right now. All of Sahil's arguments as to how that China isn't going to mobilize correctly are just not responsive to the main LOC claim, which is that China really fucking hates South Korea. They're like, the tributary system doesn't exist. No idea what this means. This is not a response. The LOC claim is just conceded, which is that China has so much animosity against South Korea. And the more proximate concern to literally any of this is that every single country is ideologically terrified of losing people that are in their backpack or losing the Cold War. Which is why even if it is the bad decision for China to do this, or even if China thinks they have other things to worry about, they will always care about this first, and they will always make these sacrifices. But the US can't make the sacrifice because the US spent all their money on war. If the US wants to make the sacrifice, they can't. China wants to make the sacrifice, and they can. They say the USSR is focused on the UN squabble. It's unclear why the UN squabble requires them to be using military issues. It's unclear what the USSR is actually worried about on their side of the house, but also all their arms race arguments are the reason as to why they want to show they want to help North Korea right now. Flex their muscles. Sorry, I'm gonna pause so you take some water.
Okay. I'm at 7:08 counting up. Okay. Resuming time in 3, 2, 1. Now, their arms race argument works against them because if they think that they want to flex their muscles, and this is the only way they can do it, that the US actually clapping back against them, then this is how they show their muscles, because the US isn't going to be able to do anything about it. Or if they do something about it, they're obviously going to be worse because the US has spent so much money and time on World War II, comparatively more than Russia. And even in the absolute worst case, the amount of time it takes for them to mobilize, or the amount of time it takes for them to get all the resources, means the best version of the US missiles, or the best version of the US arms, are not actually competing with Russia, because Russia is quite close comparatively, because they're on the same coast. The reason this argument is really important is because if all their arguments are true that Russia cares about the arms race, this is the way they show that they are ahead, because this is how they actually show their muscles without the US getting involved, which turns all their arguments against them. And for all their arguments about the UNSC and how USSR cares a lot about maintaining power on the UNSC, this is how they get that leverage, because if they win the arms race by this president, that's how they tell everybody, hey, I'm not one to fuck with, get the KMT out and get China back in, which means that's why the USSR will help you. And all these arguments operate temporally before their arguments, because these people are not constrained by the same time frame factors that the US is, and they will help you tomorrow, and they can't help you tomorrow because they're not on the same side of the ocean. Final thing is South Korea will invade you later. They say this is not going to happen because it's bad for business, but obviously it's comparative. Later on, all the economic incentives don't actually matter. The US cares way more about war than ideology, and they can actually afford to care about that later. But also, the people that are making the business decisions and people that are making the military decisions are different. The attrition turn is just beaten by the argument I made above earlier. They say you can do this after you invade, but that's like not going to be able to do this because you just fought a war. But it's unclear how they will have the resource to do that then. Perhaps we'll post.
I think I'm going to call upon LOR.
Okay. Is everyone good? I know this round is messy, but the only argument that matters at the end of the debate is the domestic instability that upstreams everything else just on a time frame level. The argument is that right now, North Korea does not have the infrastructure to build a surveillance state because people are so upset about revolt, and North Korea does not have the capacity to create or surveil and to figure out who is going to revolt unless you convince people that it's worth it. 2 links I'm going for. First is that internally the people are revolting because of a famine, and the only thing that upstreams things like famine is when people stop being rational and rally behind populist sentiment. But you can't do that because right now they attribute these feelings to you as their leader. But the second a war starts, people band around you, you get a cult of personality, and you are able to justify your surveillance state. This answers Sahil's argument that you're a dictator, so you can just be more dictatorial, because it misses the LOC nuance that you just don't have the capacity to like do top-down approaches. You need soft power to convince people that you are the leader and that they need to rally around you. This also answers all of Sahil's arguments about South Korea invading later, because it means that even if South Korea does invade later, the rival factions and the famine happens right now, and you don't know when South Korea will invade, which is a time frame argument conceded from the LOC, which means you need to act now before South Korea invades, because these warring factions are existential. The second link is just the rival factions are all fighting against each other and gather. The domestic revolt arguments just upstream everything else because of time frame, and you also don't know when you're going to die and how much power they are getting in the short term, which means that you are just scared you're going to die even if you don't actually die. And this fear argument is really important, because even if you don't die, you are scared that you're going to die, and you won't think properly when fighting the war, which upstreams their arguments that South Korea just gets an advantage when they invade first, because if you are the sole dictator, your mental state and the way that you decision make is the sole arbiter of whether you win the war, and this fear of dying first obviously upstreams all of your decision making calculus on how well you're going to make strategic decisions in the war. This also upstreams everything else, because obviously leaders care way more about proximate harm, even if in the long term there's bigger magnitude impacts like nuclear war. You care about what's most proximate to your survival right now, and these immediate threats compress decision making windows because you can't plan for these long term risks. And more importantly is that if he dies later, it doesn't matter, because he's created a surveillance state for his son and the next generation to take over, which means that he has created the infrastructure in North Korea to continue his regime, and per all the PMC arguments, all he cares about is regime survival, so he just does not care about the war and the infrastructure that's created from the war. Now all I have to do is defense on all the other probabilistic claims of what you were scared of. Note that even one piece of defense is enough to beat these arguments, because this is probably what he would be thinking in the short term. He would say, this isn't that bad as long as there's a much more proximate threat to my survival. First is there's a US invade. One top level piece of defense is that you as Kim Il-sung saw the US literally let China fall to communism and did nothing. So even if the US does get involved, you don't think they will, because they literally didn't give a fuck about a huge ally, but they care, but all of a sudden they're going to care about North Korea, which they've also conceded from the LOC is super unstrategic, which means they're just likely to not care. Yeah.
I think this idea that like your perception, like you as Kim Il-sung, your perception, even if it doesn't actually happen, that like, you know, since China fell, so it's fine, is new. If that's in the LOC, you can point to it.
Well, the top level framing argument in the LOC is that all of the arguments are just about the way that you perceive the war to happen. I think this is also just true from the PMC. This is also just straight from the LOC. Like, I can point to a line in the LOC.
This idea that like it is your perception that because China fell, it's chill if you do it. You know what I'm saying? Like, she's this. I think this is just new.
I think this is straight from the
No,
LOC.
we made these arguments in the off case when we were talking about how your perception of whether other countries invade and whether is based on the fact that China has also just fallen. And
Yeah, I just know this.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's all.
Okay.
I do 236.
Okay, yeah. Even if there's arguments about things like, for example, like nukes and things like that, every single argument that Sahil extends in the MG is just extended through ink. There are actual analysis in the LOC that give you competing claims, which is at best some form of defense as to like all of these probabilistic scenarios. But more importantly is that the time it takes for the US to mobilize is enough for you to stop the revolt, so you can at least delay the crisis later, which is obviously time frame consideration that you would be making. The second question is, does the Security Council step in? They've conceded that the Security Council will not intervene because they just don't have the capacity, because the Soviets veto every intervention. Terminal defense to their arguments about any form of mobilization. The next argument is about China and Russian allies, but here's the thing, they've conceded that these countries only invest in you now because of your stance against South Korea, and absent the fact that you don't take a hardline stance, you don't get any allies, so you see this as existential. Oh, also, they've conceded that you can always get back their support after, but if people just assassinate you now, you're just cooked. And the defense on this is that you literally cannot trade with any other countries because you don't have ports and things like that, so trade from other countries just does not matter now. But they say that if you lose the war first, people will revolt, but this also doesn't matter because you don't care about revolts later once you have created the infrastructure to surveil people and stop and have the capacity to prevent the revolts from happening, which means you need to do it right now and you need to get the popular support. But even if you do lose the war, he's okay with dying per all of the LOC arguments, because he's okay dying in the war, not from domestic revolt, because dying in the war solidifies your legacy, but dying in a domestic revolt just makes you seem a weak and ineffective leader, which is all he cares about per the LOC analysis. They say don't spend your money on war, build a port instead, but obviously this is not responsive because they've conceded the capacity arguments. The only remaining argument to beat is that South Korea will revolt later, but we preemptively beat the political impacts of this because the LOC arguments being that you want to take initiative and reunify North Korea first, and this is because they drop how you're competing for legitimacy claims against Key, so you have to be the first one. But also, them invading you after doesn't matter for the weighing at the top, but also if they spent so much time, like so much resources fighting off per Sahil's attrition turn, it means the invasion is ineffective and doesn't actually hurt you and doesn't matter. Proud to oppose.
Here, thank you all.
it's 2 ballots, but it'll like reference stuff from the round. I would just flow it as a list. Okay. Okay. Suppose we could see all the after analysis about Kim. He's a like radical like Leninist who wants to like invade the South even if he like it just seemed legitimate, etc. This leads into our ballot 1, even if we can see that. You're going to get coup during the war. We tell you that North Koreans, like the population and other government leaders, are just sick of all of the fighting because they just went through World War II, they fought the Japanese occupation, etc. Which means other leaders are waiting for an opportunity to backstab you or assassinate you or lock you in prison if you tell them they're going to get into another war. All of their after analysis, notably, only applies to Kim. Kim wants to reorganize the Koreas, bring them back, reunify them. They never do any like after analysis on what other people in your government are thinking, apart from the fact that they're warring and they disagree. But we actually give you that after analysis about the rest of your population wants, and the rest of your government wants, way back in the PMC. What do we tell you? 1, the people are fucking tired. The population and the leaders are tired. Maybe some of your troops are loyal to you, as they tell you in the LOC, but even if just one troop is sick of it, that's a chance that they're going to shoot you in the back, and there's a big risk there. But there's also the general civilians who are not mobilized in the military, who haven't seen your cult of personality this much, and they're experiencing famine, and they're also sick of you. And off themselves tells you about all of these political opponents, these like, populations who's like radicalized because of the famine. They're also sick of the war, which caused the famine in the first place. The second after analysis we give you is that people just don't want to die. People are biologically encoded to want to preserve life, which is they prefer a stable Korea that is not at war over this ideological like victory you're trying to shove at them by trying to nationalize them. They care more about food on the table than this nationalist vision you're going to try to sell to them when you try to mobilize them. This beats the MO analysis that people do want to go to war because they prefer food over nationalism. The third after analysis we tell you is that other Koreans and these other leaders prefer economic security. Why? We give you a wealth of reasons why preserving money and not going to war is better. Because colonialism drained you, because manufacturing gives you credit with China and the USSR, like etc. All of these incentives exist in the round, which means even if Kim doesn't believe this, because he's got some communist dreams, all of the other leaders do believe this. This means 1, Op can only win the argument about rallying Koreans around the flag if the Koreans actually want to rally around the fucking flag, which as I just said, they don't. Which means insofar as all of these disincentives exist in the round, you will never get all of the leaders rallied around the flag. You never get that unity in the government, even if some of them think that this is a good idea. The second thing this means is that what actually happens is that all of the people who disagree with you capitalize on this, capitalize on all of the fracturing that already exists, and use this as the breaking point to finally assassinate you or lock you up, which means the war never actually happens, and Kim never actually realizes the stream, which means even if they win, that it is some try or die mentality that Kim has. He wants to act first, he wants that legitimacy. You never get to try in the first place because you're shot before you get to mobilize the troops to begin with. Why does Kim care about this? 1, even if he doesn't care about his own life, he does care about this dream that can't happen without him because he's an experienced dictator, like whatever. They never tell you who's filling in the power vacuum apart from saying that like, his offspring can carry on the legacy. A, we don't even know that he has kids in this round, but B, as per the LOC, they tell you that there are all of these warring factions in the government, which means you prefer the PMC analysis that there's going to be a chaotic power vacuum without him, not a clean succession to his son, so the war doesn't happen without Kim. But secondly, a prerequisite to his desire of crushing the capitalist South is to actually mobilize shit against him. That can't happen if he's shot. And thirdly, you prefer this over the op claim that he just wants to take initiative and act first and not wait for the South to invade because he's a military strategist who cares about winning and actually wants the war effort to work. But even if you don't buy this and you're not cooed before the war happens, you're going to be cooed afterward because the Southerners who you conquer are going to be really fucking mad at you because they can see that the South has been like being fed with all of this propaganda against you, and secondly, the South is going to be mad at you for killing their families. Even if you try and feed them this like unified Korean nationalist dream, people are much more like biologically like close to their families, so they're more likely to be mad at you for killing their families over like loving you for this like weird pamphlet that you hand out saying that like nationalism is good. The surveillance also doesn't solve because these revolts in the South start happening before you've extended the surveillance to the South, so that doesn't solve back. Why does this matter? 1, stability after the war in South Korea is a prerequisite to the unified Korea that you actually want, and 2, Op again loses their argument about the rally around the flag effect because it makes you look really bad if the South that you conquered is now fighting and revolting against you, which means you never get that legitimacy as a ruler that's required to actually have this like Korea. Let's directly compare this to that LOR first ballot on the flow. Okay. About like domestic instability. They can see from the MG that you can establish surveillance regardless, so this doesn't actually solve back. They say that you don't have the capacity, but if you have the capacity to wage a fucking war, just use that capacity to extend the surveillance instead. Clearly you do have this capacity, but they also can see from the PMC you can better pacify the Korean masses by just fucking like addressing the famine, focusing on the economy, giving people food. Just wait, this one is better solvency because it directly solves for the reasons why the people are mad. They're in a famine. Don't give them war. Oh yeah.
think the argument is that you should invest the resources somewhere else. I think specifically it was about economics and war reports in the MG. I think saying that you should just do it for surveillance is meaningfully new.
Wait. So, you guys say in the LOC that you should do surveillance. Sahel says in the MG that you can do surveillance anyway. You guys say in the MO that you don't have the capacity to do it anyway.
Wait.
There was two arguments in the MG. The first one was if a dictator is a dictator, then he'll just be a dictator of either world. I think that is different than now this dictator can now create the infrastructure to create a surveillance.
I think the MG claim was just that surveillance exists either way, not a question of how much resources you dedicate to one or the other.
I think the second response, and then you can take it as you have it. Yeah, the second response is just that, like, whatever problem there is, take the war resources and invest in that. I was like, food, ports, and then I just lumped everything that you said.
Wait,
and was like, all this can be
I
solved.
think those were specifically in response to the economic arguments as to how you don't have, as to like why your situation is
Yeah, I
bad.
understand what's being called new, so I'll take it into consideration.
Cool.
Okay.
Yeah. I'm just saying I think the econ word is different, but yeah.
Yeah, I just think that part of the response that actually matters here is that you can do surveillance either way, and I'm cross-applying the econ stuff to respond to the capacity issue. Cool. Okay. Okay, so I'm weighing why it's better to just focus on the economy and give people food over going to work. It's a more direct link into solvency because you address the actual needs of the people. You give them food because they're in a famine, not war, because they're much less likely to revolt if you just do that. But also, it's just more probable to actually be able to help them, because if you give people food, then people will definitely eat and know that you're giving them things and addressing their situation. But if you give them war instead in this nationalist dream, they've seen from World War II and the Japanese War that doesn't instantly increase their quality of life, so they don't trust that things are actually getting better, which means we solve much better for fracturing than they do. All of this is actually solved, though, by the LOC argument that you think the South is going to invade you first. Why is this much better? One, you're not blamed for starting the conflict. The South is, which means you don't see this fracturing and rising up against you. That's much better for you. But secondly, remember Sahel's weighing that the U.S. is much more likely to get involved if they're defending the South, but much less likely to get involved if they're initiating the conflict to begin with, because as opt-outs, they're pulling out in the status quo. They say it's going to take a while for the U.S. to mobilize. But remember the PMC argument, the U.S. is just going to nuke you. They don't have to mobilize a nuclear weapon. They just say mutually assured destruction, but they can see that doesn't exist yet because the USSR doesn't have their own missiles yet. The U.S. has a lead right now. It's a basically conceded argument. Prevent the U.S. from getting involved. Let the South invade you first. Proud to propose.
Good to be here. Thanks everyone for a great round. Step outside the fight.